Sherlock Holmes and the Strange Mr. Angel. Sherlock Holmes looked down from his flat into the London street.
"Ah, Watson! Somebody is coming here,"
he said.
"Look, there, across the street."
I went to the window and saw a large woman in a big hat. She looked up at us.
"Is she coming?"
I said.
"Look, she isn't moving." "It's difficult for her,"
Holmes answered.
"She wants help, but... she's coming now."
The woman walked slowly across Baker Street to Holmes's front door.
"She has a problem,"
Holmes said.
"A problem?" "It's a man,"
Holmes said.
"She doesn't understand him, so she wants my help."
Some minutes later, Miss Mary Sutherland came into Holmes's room. She told us her name and sat down in a chair. Holmes looked at her carefully.
"Is typing difficult when you have weak eyes?" he asked her.
"It was when I started," she answered. "But now I don't have to look down at my fingers, and... Oh, how did you know?" Holmes laughed.
"I'm a detective," he said. "It's my job. This is my friend, Dr. Watson. Now, tell me, why do you want to see me?"
"I want you to find somebody for me," Miss Sutherland said. "His name is Mr. Hosmer Angel. I'm not rich, but I can pay you. I have £100 a year, and the money from my typing. My father, Mr. Windibank, doesn't know that I'm here. He doesn't want help from you or from the police. He says that I have to forget Mr. Angel, but I can't do that."
"Your father?"
Holmes said.
"Your names are different."
"I call him my father," she said. "It's strange, because he's only 5 years older than me. My mother married him a short time after my father died. He's nearly 15 years younger than her. He works for a wine company."
"Where does your £100 a year come from?"
Holmes asked. I looked at Holmes. Why is he interested in that? I thought. She wants to talk about Mr. Angel, not her money. "The money came from my Uncle Ned in New Zealand, after he died," Miss Sutherland said.
"That's very interesting,"
Holmes said.
"So you have £100 a year and the money from your typing job. Where does the money go?"
"I'm living at home, so I give my mother and father the £100, she answered. "Mr. Windibank gets it from my bank and gives it to my mother. I use the money from my typing work."
"Thank you for telling me that,"
Holmes said.
"Now, tell us about you and Mr. Hosmer Angel."
Miss Sutherland's face went red, and she looked down at her hands. "I first met him at a dance," she said.
"A dance?"
"Yes. Every year before he died, my father had tickets for a dance. Now my mother gets the tickets. Mr. Windibank didn't want us to go to the dance. 'They're not very nice people,' he said, 'and you haven't got the right clothes.' But then he went to France."
"What did he do in France?"
"He buys wine there," Miss Sutherland answered. "He often goes for 2 or 3 days. So my mother and I went to the dance."
"Was Mr. Windibank angry when he heard about that?"
Holmes asked. "No, he was very nice about it. He laughed and said, 'You can't stop women when they really want to do something.'"
"And you met Mr. Hosmer Angel at the dance?"
"Yes, I met him that night," Miss Sutherland said.
"When did you see him again?"
"He came to the house the next day. After that, I went for walks with him. But then Father came back from France, and Hosmer couldn't come to the house.
No?
No, Father doesn't like it when I have visitors, Miss Sutherland said sadly.
What did Mr. Angel do next?
Holmes asked. He wrote me a letter every day, Miss Sutherland answered. Then, a week later, Father went to France again, and Hosmer visited me.
Did Mr. Angel want to marry you?
Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes, Miss Sutherland said.
When did he ask you?
He asked me after that first walk. He worked in an office in Leadenhall Street, and—
Which office?
Holmes asked quickly. I don't know.
Where did he live?
In a room above the office, she answered. I don't know the address, only Leadenhall Street.
So where did you send your letters?
To the Leadenhall Street post office, she told him. Hosmer went there for them. They were a secret from the other men in the office.
Why?
Holmes asked. He said, I don't want them to know about you. They'll laugh at me. I said, I can type the letters, then they won't know about us. But he didn't want me to type them.
Tell me about him,
Holmes said. He was a very quiet man, a kind man. He liked to walk with me in the evening, when there weren't many people on the street.
And his clothes?
He had nice clothes, she said. He wore dark glasses because he had weak eyes. He spoke quietly, too.
What happened after Mr. Windibank went back to France?
Holmes asked. Mr. Hosmer Angel came to the house again, Miss Sutherland said. He met my mother. Then one day he said, Strange things happen in this life, but I want to know that you will always love me. He wanted to marry me on the Friday of that week.
What did your mother say?
My mother was happy about that, because she liked him too, Miss Sutherland said. I said, but aren't we going to ask Father? She said, no, we can tell him later. But I didn't want to do that. So I wrote to Father in Bordeaux.
Bordeaux?
Yes, the company has its French office there. But the letter came back to me on the Friday morning.
It was too late?
Holmes said. Yes, he left for England before it arrived.
What happened on that Friday?
Hosmer came in a cab to our house, Miss Sutherland said. The cab took Mother and me to the church, near King's Cross. Hosmer followed us in a different cab. Mother and I arrived at the church first. When the other cab arrived, we waited. But Hosmer didn't get out. There was nobody in the cab.
What happened to him?
The cab driver said.
He got in. I saw him.
That was last Friday, Mr. Holmes. Where is Hosmer? What's he doing? Why can't he write me a letter? Oh, I'm so unhappy. Holmes thought about her story.
That was very unkind, he said.
Oh, but he's kind, Mr. Holmes. That morning he said to me again, Strange things happen, but I'll always love you. I will marry you. Now I understand. He was afraid of something, and he was right. Something bad happened to him. I know it.
But what?
Holmes asked. I don't know, Miss Sutherland said sadly.
Was your mother angry?
Yes, she doesn't want to hear Hosmer's name again.
And you told Mr. Windibank about it?
Yes, she answered. Father doesn't understand it. He wants me to forget about Hosmer. But he thinks that he'll come back to me. Why does a man leave a woman at the doors of the church, Mr. Holmes? Hosmer didn't have my money. He never asked me for money. He really wanted to marry me. But where is he now? And why can't he write to me? I think about it day and night, Mr. Holmes. I can't sleep.
Miss Sutherland began to cry. "I'll find the answers to your questions," Holmes said. "But please forget Mr. Hosmer Angel."
Will I see him again? She asked.
"I'm sorry. No, you won't. Have you got his letters? Can you give them to me?"
Here are 4 of them, Miss Sutherland said. And here's an advertisement. I put it in last Saturday's newspaper.
"Thank you. What's your address?"
31 Lion Place, Camberwell, she told him.
"And what's the name of Mr. Windibank's company?" Holmes asked.
He works for Westhouse and Marbank, the wine company.
"Thank you,"
Holmes said.
"Now, forget about this man. Think about your future."
You're very kind, Mr. Holmes, but I can't do that, she said. I'll always love Hosmer. I'll be there when he comes back. I'll wait for him.
After she left, Sherlock Holmes sat quietly for some minutes. "An interesting young woman," he said.
The typing, I said. How did you know?
"Her arms, above her hands,"
Holmes said.
"There were red lines across them. A typist puts her arms on the front of her desk when she types. That leaves a line. There was also a line across her nose. She wears glasses."
For her weak eyes, of course.
"These things aren't difficult, Watson." "They aren't difficult for you, Holmes," I said. "Now read the advertisement," he said. "What does it say about Mr. Angel's clothes, hair, and face?"
I read some of it to him.
"A big man with black hair, a black beard, and dark glasses. Speaks quietly. Wore a black coat, grey trousers. Worked in an office in Leadenhall Street."
Holmes looked at the letters from Hosmer Angel to Miss Sutherland.
"These tell us nothing about Mr. Angel," he said. "But there's one strange thing." "He typed them," I said. "Yes, not only the letters, but also his name," Holmes said. "And there's no address, only Leadenhall Street. But the name is important." "Is it?" "Of course, Watson. Now, I'll write 2 letters. One letter to a company, and the other letter to Mr. Windibank." "To Windibank?" "Yes. I'll invite him to this flat at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. Before that, I hope we'll have some answers."
When I arrived at his flat at 6 o'clock the next evening, Sherlock Holmes was half asleep in his chair. "Do you have the answers?" I asked him.
"To the letters?"
"To them, yes, and to Miss Sutherland's problem," I said. "Who was the man? And why did he leave her at the church? And will she see him again?" But before Holmes could tell me, Mr. Windibank arrived. He was a big man with grey eyes, about 30 years old. He sat down in the nearest chair.
"Good evening, Mr. Windibank,"
Holmes said.
"Good evening, Mr. Holmes,"
Mr. Windibank said.
"I've got your note here," Holmes said. "I will be with you at 6 o'clock, James Windibank." "Did you type this?" "Yes, I'm a little late," Mr. Windibank said. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, too, about Miss Sutherland. I didn't want her to come here. This is a family problem, and you can't help." "Oh, but I can," Holmes said.
Mr. Windibank looked at him.
You can?"
he said.
That's wonderful." "It's strange," Holmes said. "All typewriters are different after people use them for some time." "Are they?" Mr. Windibank said. "Yes. Look at your note, Mr. Windibank. The letter E is darker than the other letters, and the bottom of the letter R isn't there. Do you see? There are 14 other little things, but you can see these two easily." "We use this typewriter for our letters at the office," our visitor said. "It's quite old now." "And here are the 4 letters from Mr. Angel," Holmes said. He typed every letter. "In each of them, the letter E is darker than the other letters, and you can't see the bottom of the R." Mr. Windibank jumped out of his chair. "I'm a busy man," he said angrily. "I can't sit here and listen to this stupid talk. When you catch the man, tell me." "All right, I will," Holmes said. He went to the door and locked it. "I'll tell you now. I caught him." "What? Where?" Mr. Windibank shouted. "Sit down and listen, Mr. Windibank. This wasn't a difficult problem." Our visitor fell back into the chair. His face was white. The police can do nothing to me," he said. "You're right, but I'm sorry about that," Holmes said. "A young woman is in love with a cold, unkind man. Now, listen to my story. A man married an older woman for her money, and for her daughter's money. The daughter's money was important to the woman and to her husband. They didn't want to lose £100 a year when she got married. They didn't want her to leave home. So, what could this man do? He didn't want her to have friends of her age, so people couldn't come to the house. She couldn't go out to dances, and then he and his wife made a plan. "We didn't want to hurt her," Mr. Windibank said. We didn't think—" "No," Holmes said. "You didn't think about the feelings of a young woman in love. But she did love him. They went for walks. He was kind to her. Her mother told her, 'He's a nice man.' The man asked the young woman, 'Will you marry me?' And the young woman said yes. But of course, he couldn't really marry her. He had a wife, the young woman's mother. It had to end. But he didn't want her to marry another nice young man. So he said to her, 'Will you wait for me?' And because she loved him, she said yes. And Mr. James Windibank is happy, because for years and years, Miss Sutherland will wait for Mr. Hosmer Angel. She won't marry another man." Mr. Angel sent the young woman to the church door with her mother in the first cab. Then he climbed into the next cab, through one door, and out of the other door. He didn't go to the church. Am I right, Mr. Windibank?" "Perhaps you are," said our visitor. "Perhaps you aren't." He got up from his chair and looked at Holmes with cold eyes. "But you can't lock the door. I don't have to stay here. The police will—" "Oh, the police can do nothing to you," Holmes said angrily. "I know that." He unlocked the door. "But does the young woman have a brother or a friend? I hope she does. And I hope he hurts you. And no, I won't wait for that. I'll do it." Mr. Windibank ran through the door before Holmes could catch him.
A minute later, we looked out of the window and saw him running very fast down the road.
"One day, that man will do something very, very bad," Holmes said. "And the police will catch him."
"I hope you're right, Holmes," I said. Holmes sat down in his chair.
"But it was an interesting problem, Watson."
"How did you know?" I began.
"Mr. Hosmer Angel was a strange man," Holmes said. "But what did he want?" I thought about Miss Sutherland's family. Who did well from all this? Her mother and Mr. James Windibank. Miss Sutherland stayed at home, so her money didn't leave their house. And the two men, Angel and Windibank, were never in the same place at the same time. Angel only visited the house when Mr. Windibank was away. "That's right," I said. "That was strange," Holmes said. The dark glasses and the beard were also very strange. And why did Mr. Angel type his name? Because Miss Sutherland knew her father's writing. "Who did you write the other letter to?" I asked. "Mr. Windibank worked for Westhouse and Marbank," Holmes said. "I wrote to them." "What did you say?" "I asked them about the man in the advertisement, but without the glasses and the beard. I also, of course, wrote to Mr. Windibank and invited him here. I had Mr. Angel's letters to Miss Sutherland, and Mr. Windibank typed his note on the same typewriter. The letter from Westhouse and Marbank gave me James Windibank's name. After that, it was easy." "Will you tell Miss Sutherland all this?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "She's a woman. She'll always think kindly of Mr. Hosmer Angel, and I can't stop her."